Afternoon, everyone. I'm Francisco Dominguez. I've been asked to chair this meeting. I'm a member of the Friends of Socialist China. And this meeting is being organized jointly by the Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group. The title I'm going to read you is a book. These ideas of which we're going to discuss very importantly. We have a fantastic panel. I will introduce them one by one when their turn to speak is. The book is Western Marxism, How It Was Born, How It Died, How It Can Be Reborn. This is a book by an Italian philosopher, writer, and few other things that he did, Domenico Losurdo. And then there's been a publication. I'll give you a promotion. A publication where this book was actually published in English, and the author is Domenico Losurdo, but the editor is Gabriel Rockhill, and the two people who wrote a very important introduction, which is quite substantial actually. I read it all, and this is by Gabriel and Jennifer, which I'll introduce later on. So let me start to introduce the subject, as it were. Domenico Losurdo was born in 1941 and died in 2018. He was a prolific Italian historian, essayist, Marxist philosopher, and communist politician. He was emeritus professor at the Urbino University and president of the Associazione Marx 21. 21 means the 21st century, of course. One of his key works, known in English, cover Liberalism, a counter-history published in 2011, which is a sharp attack on liberal hypocrisy, exposing liberals' dark side in the manifestation of the rise of colonial empires, with their attendant manifestations of colonial oppression and violence, the slave trade and slavery, racism, and its multifaceted crimes. Other books by him include Democracy or Bonapartism, 2 Centuries of War on Democracy, and then Nietzsche, I think that's how you pronounce it, The Aristocratic Rebel, Intellectual Biography and Critical Balance Sheet. Now, Western Marxism, How It Was Born, How It Died, How It Can Be Reborn, there it is, has been published in English by Monthly Review Press in 2024. It's available online from the Monthly Review website. You can buy the ebook for $13, the paperback for $32, and the cloth, which is only for special people, $89. Given that the dollar is going down the pan, this is the moment to actually go for it. So please buy it. There you go. We'll sell it to you in pounds, unfortunately, over here. Now, Domenico Losurdo was born in 1941 in San Nicandro di Bari in Puglia, one of the poorest regions in Italy then. Now it's not the same. 1941 was the year of Nazi Germany invasion of the USSR. He joined the Communist Party of Italy when he was 19 years old. He left the party in 1991 when he became the Partito Democratico della Sinistra, that is to say, when he moved to the right, the party, and joined Rifondazione Comunista. Then he joined the Partito dei Comunisti Italiani, I'm practicing my Italian here, in 1998, and then the Partito Comunista d'Italia in 2011. So you can really see that as the party begins to move in the wrong direction, he keeps looking for a better alternative. The key issue examined in Losurdo's Western Marxism, and as in the title of the book, is the difference between Western and Eastern Marxism. Losurdo's book identified key phases of the development of Western and Eastern Marxism that covered the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and then Western Marxism and their attitude to the anti-colonial revolution, which the book discusses at length. Actually, if you look at the part 1 is the Bolshevik Revolution, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5 discuss the various attitudes of Western Marxism all the way through regarding the anti-colonial revolution. Part 6 is the only part where he discusses how Western Marxism can be reborn. The issues examined, just to give you an idea to whet your appetite, include the Haitian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Cold War, African liberation, Algeria, Vietnam, Cuba, Venezuela, and just about almost everything else. The gist of the book we will be examining today provides an incisive critique of the Western left intelligentsia whose dominant ideological orientation characterized by defeatism, utopianism, and anti-communism is rooted in the political economy of imperialism. In the introduction done by Gabriel and Jennifer, they put the following points, which maybe you will be able to correct me or clarify or expand. Western Marxism is a product in part of the imperialist ideological superstructure. Number two, Western Marxism is a subjective agency that operates within that objective material reality. That is to say, within the context of imperialism. And because Marxism could not be eliminated in the West, a version of it has emerged, which is ultimately compatible with capitalism. 4 point, Western Marxism therefore is a broadly ideological project of radical recuperation, which will be explained later on, and it tends to be antagonistic to real socialist effort to break the imperialist chain. One very important argument, which I'm going to quote at length, it's not too long, which is very poignant in my view by Gabriel and Jennifer in the introduction, is worth highlighting. Far from being strictly geographic terms, however, Eastern and Western are used more generally to refer to two different political orientations, both of which have manifested themselves around the world. One of them is dedicated to the difficult and drawn-out process of building socialism in a capitalist-dominated world, and in particular, across the global south, which has been the principal site for such endeavors thus far. The other, Western Marxism, is generally dismissive of such practical undertakings, often belittling concrete struggles against imperialism because they do not live up to an imagined standard of theoretical or moral purity. Let me put it in colonial terms as a Londoner. In short, when it comes to proper socialism, Western Marxism knows better. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Jennifer Ponce de León. I thought she was a relative of Juan Ponce de León, who actually discovered and conquered Puerto Rico, but she tells me it's not true. She is an associate professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania, where she's also faculty in Latin American Latin Studies and Comparative Literature, affiliated in Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies and Cinema Studies, and a member of the graduate groups in Hispanic Studies and Art History. She's also Associate Director of the Critical Theory Workshop. She is the author of Another Aesthetics is Possible, Arts of Rebellion in the Fourth World War, published in 2021. And she is co-author with Gabriel, sitting next to her, the co-author with Gabriel of the introduction to the English translation of Losurdo book, which it just explained. Just to give you a flavor of her politics, Dr. Ponce de León held a public conversation with Boots Riley, a US film director, scriptwriter, rapper, and communist activity. I cannot tell you anymore because I don't want to discredit him. Title, Revolution is the Solution. Revolution is the solution. Please add anything that you want to your, the floor is yours, Jennifer.
Thanks so much.
Sorry.
Thank you. Is this okay? Thank you so much for that introduction, Francisco. Thank you all very much for being here. And I just wanted to express my gratitude to Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group, especially to Carlos Martinez, to the Marx Memorial Library, and to Francisco and my fellow panelists. So in Western Marxism, Domenico Losurdo identifies patterns in Western theoretical discourses that themselves dominate what passes for progressivism within the Western academy and theory industry. The tendencies he identifies are apparent not only in Western Marxism, but also in many variants of Western theory that are rooted in liberal, pseudo-anarchist, and postmodernist presumptions, including post-colonial theory and decolonial theory. This book helped me understand my own academic formation within the imperial core, and I think it's essential reading for those who want to be something other than passive consumers of the imperial theory industry. It elucidates this industry's indulgence in utopian thinking, as well as the political economic basis of an all too common phenomenon wherein intellectuals who purport to be progressive and even Marxist take positions that align them with imperialist state managers and the bourgeois media. This is seen, for example, in US-based intellectuals who, in effect, support US-led regime change operations with their readiness to publicly decry the purported authoritarianism of socialist states. Now, as Francisco noted, it's important to understand that the object of this book's critique, Western Marxism, doesn't refer to geography, but rather to an ideological orientation that is common in the capitalist West, one that readily denigrates socialist states when their actions do not live up to intellectual standard of theoretical or moral purity. It also, therefore, names a type of intellectual practice in which Marxist theory is detached from collective efforts to build the power of the working class. Now, Losurdo develops in this book the important critique of populism, which Lenin identified as an ideological position that celebrates the moral excellence of those who are oppressed and bereft of power, without scientifically identifying the means to effectively struggle against this oppression. Populists are generally skeptical of, if not explicitly opposed to, political parties as well as the exercise of state power. For them, getting organized through the party at form, like seeking to take over the state apparatus, inexorably leads to new forms of oppression that besmirch the moral excellence of the downtrodden. Identifying populism as a petty bourgeois ideology, Lenin noted that it is characterized by a disregard for the class position of the intelligentsia, which fosters the belief that they are capable of dragging history along another course with the force of their ideas alone. Losurdo points out the irony that populist ideologies lead intellectuals to only side with the oppressed only as long as they are losing. And he recalls that this is the same position that Hegel criticized in Christians, who, in order to accomplish their obligation to serve the poor, needed the institution of poverty to persist indefinitely. Rebellionism is another characteristic of Western Marxism that Losurdo identifies in this book. It celebrating insurgency and revolt for their own sake, without sufficient analysis of their context or political orientation. Many Western Marxists exalt the figure of the rebel, whom they present as anti-dogmatic, free, and morally superior to state-centric socialists and party intellectuals, who they then denigrate as authoritarian or conformist. This libertarian orientation, which segues in important ways with liberal ideology, amounts to a thoughtless embrace of the figure in revolt, which is often a projection of these theorists' own fantastic self-image as a radically free agents. The problem is that rebellionism can lend itself to wildly distinct political projects, as rebels can, of course, include dissidents from socialist states, as well as insurgent movements promoted by imperialist governments and NGOs to destabilize governments they have targeted. This important fact is unfortunately lost to some intellectuals whose doctrinaire anti-statism leads them to see all states as only instruments of repression. As Max Eil noted in a recent article, we have many historical examples of this blinkered and selective solidarity that fetishizes a people while demonizing their state in order to justify the destruction of the latter in the name of the former. Imperialist campaigns against the governments of Venezuela, Cuba, Libya, Syria, and Iran are all just a few examples. Indeed, in his article, Eil notes specifically appeals to Western anti-statism to justify its deadly aggression against Palestinians and Iranians, insisting that this is directed only and justly at Hamas or at Iran's government. As Isle suggests, Westerners who think they can be in solidarity with the people while supporting the destruction of their state either misunderstand the vital functions of states in regard to self-defense and social reproduction, or they indulge in a Eurocentric chauvinism that only recognizes the life-sustaining and protective functions of states when these are located in the global north. And while many Western Marxists dedicate themselves exclusively to negative critique, those who propose some kind of alternative to the extant order often traffic in magical thinking and a belief in the most suspect forms of idealist utopian salvation. Losurdo argues that this reflects the influence of Judeo-Christian ideologies and their messianism in particular. It is manifested in the tendency to project a vision of the future as totally other than what currently exists, and with the notion that this future cannot be arrived at through extant institutions, rather it must break with all of these and arrive on the scene more or less miraculously. Finally, Western Marxists often fail to understand the life or death struggle for development faced by nation states that have been subject to colonial, semi-colonial, or neo-colonial domination. Developing the productive forces is needed not only to provide for the needs of people who have been subject to the underdevelopment imposed by imperialism, it is also necessary if these countries are in relations of economic dependency. In this context, the dissolution of the state is not desirable, despite the utopian expectations of many Western Marxists. Many Western Marxists, according to Losurdo, suffer from a revolutionary romanticism, where they are fascinated by the armed phase of struggles for national independence, but they fail to appreciate how this struggle moves from a political military phase to a political economic phase, wherein the development of the productive forces takes on central importance. This is essentially a failure to account for the exigencies of struggling against neocolonialism. It results in Western Marxists' lack of support for socialist states' efforts at economic and technological development, and their failure to understand its importance for maintaining political independence. This tendency is clearly evident in many Western Marxists' readiness to condemn socialist states for contradictions their development produces, while ignoring the stakes of this development in the context of imperialism's assaults. And this ideological tendency reflects the objective social positioning of these theorists within developed consumer societies. This tendency is also evident in a utopian anti-developmentalism that has also flourished within the Western critical theory. It includes some forms of radical environmentalism as well as contemporary neo-indigenous populism. For instance, many decolonial theorists decry efforts at national development pursued by progressive Latin American states without offering any viable alternative beyond vague appeals to non-capitalist indigenous cosmovisions. This recalls a critique of populism and indigenismo published over 40 years ago, in which Hector Diaz-Polanco and Stephen Gorman identified a, quote, petty bourgeois view that is based on an idealization of non-capitalist socioeconomic systems, while being associated organically with capitalism, that assumes the defense of campesino and indigenous interests. As they noted, populists do not realize that they desire to defend and conserve a system that capitalism has already begun to affect profoundly, and their refusal to address the contradictions produced by capitalism in indigenous and peasant communities ultimately makes them entirely ineffective at defending these communities. More recently, the Argentine scholar Otilio Borrón has critiqued forms of anti-development discourse in Latin America that also traffic in an indigenista populism. Such discourses have been used to critique progressive governments like those of Evo Morales in Bolivia or in Rafael Correa in Ecuador. And Borrón argues that these critiques have often ignored real needs for development among the region's popular classes. They also suffer from an impractical impatience in regard to the realities of transitioning to renewable sources of energy and the time and resource this takes. Borrón also questions those who insist on the need for a transition to an ecological civilization in Latin America while eschewing a social revolutionary path to achieve it. There is, of course, no doubt that ecological movements have a necessary and important place in building socialism. However, it is also important to recognize their populist variants that are used to discredit governments oriented towards socialism or those that cooperate economically with China. The role of an anti-extractivist campaign funded by US NGOs and foundations in the defeat of Correísmo in Ecuador's presidential election in 2021 is a case in point. And what has happened in that country since then makes very clear that if Latin American disputes regarding the direction of national development do not clearly account for the imperialist class relations and against which that development must struggle, they risk being subordinated to and utilized by US-led imperialism. It should also be crystal clear that US imperialism's agenda for Latin America entails the region's de-development that enables imperialist extraction, unequal exchange, and political subordination. Losurdo elucidates the objective social forces that have produced Western Marxism as a remarkably consistent ideology in imperialist countries, as well as in class strata in the periphery that aspire to imperialist rewards. In short, it is grounded in the political economy of imperialism. We can understand this by looking to Lenin's indictment of chauvinism among the labor aristocracy that exists in imperialist states. Lenin argued that the imperialist extraction of monopolist superprofits from peripheral societies had created a stratum among the working classes of imperialist countries that enjoy higher wages and better living conditions, resulting in their identification with the interests of their own national bourgeoisies over and against those of their fellow proletarians in other countries. The ideological tendencies I have identified, all of which express chauvinism on the part of Western intellectuals, as well as a profound misunderstanding of the effects of imperialism in the global South, are ultimately rooted in their class position as members of a global labor aristocracy. They are the Western Marxists that Losurdo critiques are all professional intellectuals ensconced in elite networks in the global North and belonging to what some call the new petty bourgeoisie, meaning the professional managerial class stratum in the imperialist core. The opportunism that is manifest in their critiques of socialist modernization can be further elucidated by an analysis of this class position. Nikos Poulantzas describes it thusly: afraid of proletarianization below, attracted to the bourgeoisie above, while often being resentful of its overlords but devoid of a long-term collective political project, the new petty bourgeoisie sometimes celebrates jacqueries and supports greater access to power for its social group. However, it does not generally seek concrete system change because it does not want to break the ladders by which it imagines it can climb. It is here that it becomes clear that many of the Western Marxists within this class stratum occupy the position of radical recuperators. That is, they present representing the interests of the oppressed, but given that they have no practical program for social transformation, they ultimately seek to recuperate potentially insurgent forces within the capitalist order by guiding people towards symbolic or discursive solutions, such as consumerism within the confines of the imperial theory industry. And these false solutions to very real problems have the added benefit of bolstering the social standing of the petty bourgeois producers of these intellectual consumer goods. Losurdo's book identifies the idealism and utopianism that plagues Western Marxism and many other purportedly radical forms of contemporary theory. Yet he makes clear that there is much more at stake than these philosophical errors. Ultimately, what is at stake is understanding imperialism and the practicalities of struggling against it. It is also a matter of the position one takes in this class struggle. As Losurdo puts it, Western intellectuals should ask themselves if their critiques of the unfulfilled promises of socialism's anti-colonial revolution are a sufficient reason to align themselves with the neo-colonial counter-revolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. My brain was still absorbing as much as possible, and I was identified with just about everything you were saying regarding how bad we do things in the global South. You see what I mean? Clearly the case that the global South must take into account imperialism as a central factor. And the battle is not ideological, it's political in that sense. We'll come back to this point later on, but thank you very much. That was fantastic. So this is another incentive for you to get the book. Our next speaker is Gabriel Rockhill. He's the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop. He's professor of philosophy and global interdisciplinary studies at Villanova University in Pennsylvania in the United States. And he's the author or editor of 12 books. One of them is The Logic of History, 2010, Radical History and the Politics of Art, 2014, Interventions in Contemporary Thought, 2016, Counter History of the Present, 2017, as well as numerous scholarly and general public articles. He's also the director of cultural studies at Villanova University. He's a research associate at the Laboratoire d'Anthropologie Politique. This is my French now. In Paris, one of the editors-in-chief of the World Marxist Review and co-editor of the book series AIM, Anti-Imperialist Marxism. He has made numerous media appearances related to his scholarship and interventions in public debates. Add anything you want. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to start by thanking all of the organizers and speakers, the Marx Memorial Library for hosting us, Friends of Socialist China, International Manifesto Group, Iskra Books, who we have here in the back of the room, and of course all of the panelists that I'm sharing this platform with. It is a pleasure to collaborate with everyone on this book panel, and what to do is to explain why I think this book is important, not to an academic audience, but why this book is important for understanding the current state of the left, in particular in the imperial core, and the direction I think that left needs to move in order to solve the problems that are diagnosed by Losurdo. So the dominant left forces, and here I mean the kind of hegemonic mainstream left, not the left, hopefully, that's represented largely in this room. This dominant left in the imperial core has a strong penchant for supporting capitalism and imperialism. Although they sometimes advocate for a friendlier version of capitalism on the home front, supporting certain social welfare measures or cultural inclusivity, they are generally pro-war and in favor of destroying the global South for the benefit of the global North, though they might not express this reality in such frank terms, preferring instead the ideological discourse of democracy promotion or anti-authoritarianism. Moreover, this imperial left is generally hostile to, or at least skeptical of, those countries in the global South that have broken the chains of imperialism and are doing their best to advance sovereign projects of autonomous development in a hostile world, if it be Cuba, Venezuela, China, or other such examples. The left in the imperial core is thus largely a compatible left. It is compatible with capitalist and imperialist interests, while generally being hostile to anti-imperialist projects like those just mentioned. If we are going to put a halt to the forms of global social murder and ecological destruction that characterize the current imperial world order, then overcoming this imperial complicity of the Western left is of the utmost importance. Losurdo's book on Western Marxism provides us with an incisive diagnosis of the dominant left ideology in the imperial core, and it insightfully identifies the principal driving forces behind it. It thereby arms us in important ways for the fight against this ideology and the powers undergirding it. Losurdo's work draws, and Jennifer just mentioned this, on the insightful critique of the labor aristocracy found in Engels and in Lenin. Like them, he recognized that the working class in the imperial core is positioned at the apex of global labor pyramids, and they benefit from the wages of colonialism. But what Losurdo focuses on more specifically is what we might refer to as the intellectual labor aristocracy, meaning he's concentrating on those intellectuals situated in the imperial core who both economically and symbolically are at the apex of intellectual labor pyramids. In that regard, he is extending Engels and Lenin's analysis to very specifically focus on theoretical production. What he demonstrates, among other things, is that within the imperial core, a form of Marxism has developed, known as Western Marxism, that functions in harmony with the interests of imperialism. Since this might surprise readers familiar with at least the self-presentation of some Western Marxists who claim that they're communists, perhaps the only true communists, and they also then often grandstand in terms of a critique of the Marxism that's affiliated with actually existing socialism, saying it's not true Marxism, it's not authentic Marxism, and other such things. I'd like to share with you a few representative quotes. The first is, quote, "The important tradition of socialism is to be fundamentally called into question, since everything that this socialist tradition has produced in history is to be condemned," end quote. This is Michel Foucault. Quote, "The failure of all socialist and communist experiences in the last century had as its consequence that we do not have today a great and clear idea of another world," end quote. Alain Badiou, the self-proclaimed French communist, likely the leading French intellectual or the most representative of the French intellectual left today. Quote, "Communism, and more specifically Stalinism, is maybe the worst ideological, political, ethical, social, and so on, catastrophe in the history of humanity." Slavoj Žižek. Quote, "Socialism and capitalism never were opposites, but rather, as many critical analysts of the Soviet Union claimed, socialism is a regime for the state management of capitalist production," end quote. This is Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. Foucault, for those familiar with his biography, was a self-proclaimed anti-communist for his entire life, with the exception of a brief post-68 rebranding campaign during which he briefly found common cause with French Maoists and other self-styled radicals. The other three authors, Badiou, Žižek, well, Hart and Negri, I'm putting as one author, so excuse my bad math, they figured prominently in a verso book entitled The Idea of Communism. We see here clearly that the idea of communism, or socialism, for these Western Marxists stands in the starkest possible contrast to the practice. They're pro-communist in theory and adamantly anti-communist in practice. This is one of the core features of Western Marxism. At the center of Losurdo's book is an insightful critique of the fundamental problem with the Western left. It does not grasp the principal contradiction that characterizes the world order, namely the conflict between the imperial powers and the regions of the world that are struggling against imperialism. Moreover, this same left generally does not recognize that the single greatest impediment to imperialism is the social system that puts forth and is in the process of building an alternative world order, namely socialism. In looking at world politics today, many on the left in the imperial core assume, for instance, that it's Russia that is imperialist, or at least a militant aggressor to be condemned. Iran is to be denounced as a dangerous threat and is imperialist or sub-imperialist. It is often seen, like Hamas, as first and foremost a fundamentalist regime hostile to human rights. If the mainstream Western left sees anything of value in the actions of Russia, Iran, or Hamas, it is generally assumed that these positives can only be underscored if one simultaneously condemns them. Neither Washington nor Moscow is the mantra, neither Israel nor Iran. China often suffers the same fate. To take but one telling example, let us consider the public stance taken by Etienne Balibar. Balibar is one of the most famous students of Louis Althusser, a representative of Western Marxism. He's often in London teaching at Birkbeck and other places. He has an appointment at Columbia University in New York, as well as he's an emeritus professor in Paris. He's a self-declared communist and one of the most well-known living Western Marxists. He contributed to the Verso book series that I just mentioned, The Idea of Communism. He asserted in a 2022 interview that, quote, "It is not NATO aggression that pushed Putin into the war," end quote. And, quote, "Pacifism is not an option," end quote, when it comes to the situation in Ukraine. He claimed that it is imperative to support the Ukrainian resistance without mentioning its fascist character and Nazi collaborationist roots. He also openly supports armed European intervention into the conflict, economic sanctions, and hybrid warfare, and he even insists, against the renowned anti-communist intellectual Noam Chomsky, that Europe should not open an exit door to Putin in order to be able to resolve the conflict. In brief, he provides a quote-unquote Marxist justification for the imperialist proxy war against Russia that fits more or less perfectly within the dominant ideological framework of the West. Much of the mainstream Western left, like the academic Marxist left in the imperial core, tends to take what I would refer to as a non-dialectical and moralizing approach that coalesces very well with the ideological discourse of democracy promotion, and the racist slandering of so-called Oriental despotism. Each country is isolated and judged in terms of moral absolutes that are largely conditioned by the liberal ideology of a free society, meaning, strictly speaking, a society where the ruling class is free to exploit and indoctrinate, and the working class is free to be exploited and indoctrinated. However, no country stands in isolation as an entity disconnected from the global imperialist dynamic, which should be judged solely in terms of an absolute moral standard. Moreover, countries are related to one another through deep material histories of interaction, and every one of them has its own specific material history. Contemporary Iran and historic Palestine, for instance, can't be separated from the history of the US-led coup d'etat against the democratically elected leader of Iran in 1953, and the pan-imperialist settler colonial project of mobilizing religious fundamentalism to drive a wedge into the pan-Arab socialist movement and exercise control over one of the world's most important geostrategic and economic sites. Methodologically, what the mainstream Western left suffers from is a reified, anti-dialectical approach to the contemporary world. Such an approach turns its nose up at the rigorous materialist analysis of geopolitics in favor of moral reductionism and virtue signaling on the part of the imperial professional managerial class stratum. This leaves the Western left completely bereft of strategic thought and practice. A dialectical and materialist analysis of contemporary geopolitics, which is precisely the perspective promoted by Losurdo, allows us to cultivate a strategic approach that always centers global class struggle and the fight against imperialism. The strategy, meaning the overall goal, is to develop the world from its current imperialist model of global social murder and ecocide in the direction of a socialist world order founded on the healthy growth of the biosphere and the use of value to satisfy the needs and develop the potentialities of human beings on planet Earth. The current context has been marked by decades of neoliberal counter-revolution, the brutal and destructive dismantling of Soviet-style socialism, which also led to the collapse of other socialist governments, and a major setback in ideological class struggle around socialism. There is not currently a large socialist bloc that could work together to push toward the strategy or the overall goal. However, just as many socialist revolutions have been made through tactical alliances with the national bourgeoisie and the national petty bourgeoisie against their common enemies, today we are faced with diverse projects of national development that share a common enemy. While their overall goal is by no means global socialism, if you think of countries like Russia and Iran and many other examples that we could highlight, they are intent on fighting the imperialist world order. However, if the latter, meaning the imperialist world order, is defeated, or at least weakened, it will create a situation that is much more favorable to the project of global socialism. Given all of this, the most coherent approach from a dialectical and materialist vantage point is to recognize the difference between tactical and strategic allies. All of those countries and movements willing to fight imperialism can serve as tactical allies, even if they are not socialist, and even if they engage in practices that many Marxists would rightfully criticize. Such tactical compromises in the current material situation are absolutely necessary. This is one of the reasons that the world's most powerful socialist country, China, is working with such a heteroclite group of allies to combat imperialism and develop an alternative international architecture. These moves in the direction of a multipolar world are not, of course, ends in themselves. They are instead stepping stones toward the next stage of struggle. To conclude, I'd like to connect these thoughts to one of Losurdo's most important contributions. Socialism, he maintained, is a process of learning. It's not a doctrine or a dogma, and the best elements of the socialist tradition have always engaged in rigorous materialist analysis and self-critique in order to advance socialism not in their thoughtscape, but in the real material world. The slow-motion defeat of imperialism that we are currently witnessing, at least in its early stages, is not playing itself out exactly like some would hope, and it's not following patterns identified by some of the most insightful authors of the 19th and early 20th centuries. There have been major upsets and setbacks and unforeseen developments. However, the most developed elements of the socialist tradition recognize that it is practice that is primary, not theory, and that the best form of theory is constantly learning from practice. What we desperately need today, and what Losurdo helps us with, is the cultivation of more rigorous materialist analysis of the contemporary situation, combined with a self-critical overcoming of the more dogmatic and doctrinaire elements of the Marxist and especially the Western Marxist tradition. Let us learn from the book and carry forth its important lessons in our practical struggles. Thank you.
Whoa, another. This is the double whammy now. The imperialists have trained, their cadres with our ideology to fight against us, which is not a revelation, but we fight against them all the time. And it's quite difficult because they know the discourse. But regarding the question of it, this is not a question, it's just a point I want to make. The question of the United Front with non-proletarian forces. I remember asking leading members of the MAS in Bolivia, what was the nature of their thing? And the explanation was like this. He said, this is a social revolution, but it's being driven by the peasantry, which is 85% of the population, or 60, 70% of the population, which are not peasants anymore because they've been displaced from the land. And they work in the cities as small entrepreneurs. So sociologically, he said to me, it's petty bourgeois, but they're pushing the direction of that. He said, then he looked at me like this, he said, find that in any book. So you're absolutely right. So thank you very much for that, which was, wonderful insight. Then our next speaker is Alex Gordon, former president of the Transport Union RMT, Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers, a leading member of the Communist Party of Britain, an activist against neoliberal austerity, but especially active on anti-imperialist activities. This involves Cuba, Venezuela, Latin America in general, Palestine, the Stop the War Coalition, and much more. He's also chair of the trustees of the Marx Memorial Library, so he better behave, otherwise he's in charge. He writes regularly for the Morning Star, primarily on trade unions and working class issues in the UK, and internationally with articles such as the following. Marx will recognize today's world corrupt and decadent capitalist greed. Another title is Our Trade Unions Must Make Anti-Strike Laws Inoperable. A third one, Labor Strategic Defense Review, nothing to do with defense or security at all. And finally, the final item I want to quote him, only socialism will secure a green transition. Alex, the floor is yours.
Comrades, I'm aware it's really warm in here. There's a door at the back there. If one of the comrades can open it, is it already open? Is it? All right, never mind. I'm trying to deal with the material conditions. So thank you so much, Francisco and Jennifer and Gabriel, and to Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be able to join this panel. And having just heard those previous two contributions, some of what I'm going to say might sound a bit familiar. But I want to talk about the book and Losurdo's critique, not as an academic, but as I was introduced as a trade unionist and a communist. And I think it's an extremely useful publication. That's the first thing to say about it. It's beautifully written, and it's in short, bite-sized passages which lead you intellectually through the process that Losurdo is critiquing. So he's confronting in this Western Marxism born, how it died, how it can be reborn, the intellectual underpinnings of this tradition, so-called Western Marxism. And he's demanding that we reconsider the theoretical divide that Gabriel and Jennifer have just described between Western and Eastern Marxism, which emerges clearly after October 1917. And Western Marxism's subsequent intellectual retreat into philosophical abstraction, instead of engaging with real existing struggles against imperialism, which hopefully has reached its nadir or its last gasp in today's reactionary identity politics, which we see on campuses in this country and in the United States. So to start with, the concept of Western Marxism, championed by the Frankfurt School and Perry Anderson in this country, amongst others, is a contradictory and contested concept. Marx and Engels, for sure, were born in Western Germany, educated at German universities, in Western legal and philosophical traditions, intellectual traditions of post-Enlightenment, post-Napoleonic Western Europe. But Marx was an outsider. He was a Jew whose father was barred from practicing law himself because of his non-Western religion. Marx and Engels first met in the intellectual hothouse of Berlin's young Hegelian movement in the 1830s, drawn together by their shared goal of critiquing and appropriating Hegel's dialectical method and moving beyond Hegelian idealism. And their lifelong intellectual commitment and collaboration was based on inverting, overturning Western philosophical traditions. And the young Hegelians emerged from the philosophical legacy of George Hegel. They engaged in critical discussions about philosophy, politics, and society in early 19th century Germany. And Marx and Engels set out to overturn Hegelian idealism, which emphasized the primacy of ideas and emphasized that consciousness was shaped, and the role of ideas and consciousness in shaping material reality. For Marx and Engels, famously in the German ideology 1845, life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. And again, in the contribution to the critique of political economy in 1859, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but their social being that determines their consciousness. So this materialist perspective is the philosophical foundation of Marxist thought. From the Theses on Feuerbach to the Communist Manifesto, the material conditions, the economic base, and the social, legal, political, ideological superstructures determined by and reflected in the material base are what drive historical and social change. Marx and Engels shared this critique of Hegelian idealism, and particularly its idealist interpretation of history and society. And this formed the foundation for their lifelong intellectual and political comradeship. And this intellectual convergence led them to develop their own theories of historical and dialectical materialism, class struggle as the engine of history, and of the potential for a communist revolution. So, on the face of it, the first thing I want to say about this thesis of Losurdo's is that it's quite paradoxical to find in Western Marxism a branch of Marxism choose for itself a label that is so seemingly at variance with the intellectual tradition that it lays claim to. Western Taoism, anyone? Western Shintoism? I mean, where does this idea come from that such a profoundly revolutionary tradition challenging the basis of Western philosophy can be appropriated as a form of Western Marxism? Secondly, the immense and world-changing body of work that Marx and Engels created was not, as has been claimed by some writers, Eurocentric. In his journalism for the New York Tribune, the newspaper founded by Horace Greeley, of which we hold a complete set here in the library, Marx challenged Eurocentrism, particularly regarding colonialism and the impact on India, Persia, and China. I would point out the three of the sites of imperialist focus today. He critiqued British imperialism in India and the opium trade's destructive impact on China, highlighting its exploitative nature. Marx was defiantly anti-Eurocentric in perspective. And Marx saw these colonial ventures as driven by capitalist interests and resulting in brutal exploitation of local populations. In his writings on India, Marx exposed the destructive consequences of British rule, arguing that it hindered the country's economic development and perpetuated social inequality. He criticized the British East India Company for forcing opium production and addiction on the Chinese people in the name of free trade. Marx saw the opium trade as a tool of British imperialism. He argued it was a barrier to China's economic progress and pointed out how British merchants were using opium to undermine China's sovereignty and profit from addiction. The dual purpose to undermine the sovereignty of China and to create profits from capitalist trade. By analyzing these real-time situations that occurred during his lifetime from the perspective of the colonized, Marx offered a critique of European power structures and their impact on the rest of the world. And he showed his readers that the benefits of European progress came at the expense of other nations and other peoples. Of course, in Marx's great work, Capital, and in the Communist Manifesto, he is concerned to analyze industrial capitalism, which was the economic basis of the West. But Marx saw clearly that the laws of motion of capital and the social relations of capitalism that he was discovering and describing existed independently of Europe or the Western developing capitalist economies. Marx understood capitalism as a world system, sweeping all before it, sweeping away pre-existing social relations. The famous quote from chapter 1 of the manifesto, where Marx and Engels wrote, "The constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind." And then he says, "The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere." Now, thirdly, the third point I want to make is about the pessimism of Western Marxism, which seems to be, to me, to be a subterfuge and an alibi for a willful retreat from engagement and commitment by intellectuals with class politics and class struggle. Perry Anderson wrote that the so-called hidden hallmark of Western Marxism is that it's the product of defeat, namely in the defeat that Western Marxism and Western Marxists, soi-disant Western Marxists always refer to, is the defeat of the proletarian revolutions in the West and the isolation of Russia and the Soviet Russia and the Russian Revolution in the East during the early 1920s. But this is hardly a new development. In fact, it's over 100 years old. Lenin, no pessimist, wrote in 1920 in his preface to the English and French editions of Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. The international split of the entire working class movement is now quite evident. The second and the third internationals. The fact that armed struggle and civil war is now raging between the two trends is also evident in Germany, the same thing in Finland, Poland, Hungary, etc. And then he asks, what is the economic basis of this world historical phenomenon? It is precisely the parasitism and decay of capitalism, characteristic of its highest historical stage of development, i.e. imperialism. George Lukács and the Frankfurt School criticized the so-called orthodox Marxism for failing to awake this proletarian consciousness in the 1920s. But why did they think that the proletarian revolts of 1919 in Ireland, in Italy, in Germany, and in 1920 in Hungary were defeated? Their answer was that orthodox Marxism had failed to uncover the domination of commodity fetishism or reification that had seeped into all spheres of capitalist society and prevented a revolutionary consciousness from bearing fruit. This seems to me to be a rather idealistic and, if I may say so, Occidentalist approach. Leninists understood that the split in the working class that became visible in August 1914 in Western Europe, exemplified by the Second International Party's support for the war aims of their national governments, and in 1919, with the murder of German revolutionary socialists Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg by the pro-war Social Democratic Party leaders, was the result of enormous super profits. And here I am covering the same territory that Jennifer referred to earlier, used to bribe the Labour leaders and the upper stratum of the Labour aristocracy in 1,000 different ways, direct and indirect, overt and covert. Thus, the material basis for the split in the working class movement was, to quote Lenin, a stratum of workers turned bourgeois, or the Labour aristocracy, who are quite Philistine in their mode of life, in the size of their earnings, and in their entire outlook. And Lenin described this as the principal prop of the Second International. And he says, in our days, the principal social, not military prop, and I'm again covering some similar territory to Jennifer, who referred to people who don't understand the difference of the move from political military to political economic stages. The principal social, not military prop of the bourgeoisie, for they are the real agents of the bourgeoisie in the working class movement, the Labour lieutenants of the capitalist class, the real vehicles of reformism and chauvinism. So Lenin didn't see false consciousness or reification as the main block to revolutionary socialism in imperialist countries. He identified the material interest of a layer of Labour leaders, and he argued that unless the economic roots of this phenomenon are understood and its political and social significance is appreciated, not a step can be taken forward. The solution of the practical problem of the communist movement and of the impending social revolution. And for the role of the Labour aristocracy, and again, I fear I'm treading on the same ground that Gabriel and Jennifer recently trod on, for the role of the Labour aristocracy, the so-called Labour lieutenants of 1920, we can perhaps substitute Western academia, responsible for the social and ideological reproduction of the ruling ideas in our own times. And I'm just going to, I'm almost finished, Francisco, but I'm just going to say something here that occurred to me. Gabriel was speaking, which is that the problem that Lenin was grappling with in the 1920s, and the communists in Germany in particular were grappling with, was the problem of the United Front. And the fact is, it's extremely difficult to form a united front with somebody who doesn't want to form a united front with you, especially when they're trying to kill you. So the party, how, and we saw what happened in Germany was the great tragedy of the 20th century. But of course, where was the United Front actually applied? The anti-imperialist United Front, as described by the Comintern, was applied in China by the Communist Party of China, and it was applied from 1924, I believe. They applied it twice. There were two separate United Fronts. The first one ended in betrayal, disaster, the massacre of Chinese communists in Shanghai, and the second United Front resulted in the victorious revolution in the People's Republic of China being founded in 1940. They applied the theory correctly. That's what I'm trying to get to. And they were successful. And that's the lesson that Marxists need to be learning from. Even today, the Communist Party of China has a United Front work department. All cadre, and the Communist Party of China, which by the way has just reached 100 million members, the Communist Party of China, every cadre has to engage in United Front work. And they regard United Front work today as being of absolute importance for their cadre. We should learn from this. So I want to finish by saying that it's important to remember that Marxism also contains other political traditions, of course, of far greater and far more lasting significance. In this library, we hold the archives in this room, in fact, of 2,500 volunteers of the British and Irish international brigades, including communists who risked their own lives in Spain from 1936 to 1938, as well as Marxist historians, economists, and scientists whose work engaged with the base as well as with its superstructure. In the 20th century, peoples armed by Marxist ideas and led by communists defeated imperialism and warlordism in Germany, China, Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, South Africa, to name a few. In 1905, Lenin wrote on confounding pedagogics with politics, we have quite a few social democrats who give way to pessimism every time the workers suffer a reverse in single battles with the capitalists or with the government, and who scornfully dismiss all mention of the great and lofty aims of the working class movement. Adequate degree of our influence on the masses. 12 years later, the world's first socialist state was born. So the key lesson that we get from Losurdo is that we have to learn from our real history, not the history that is handed to us by the scriptwriters, frankly, of postmodernism and the Western Marxist tradition. Thanks very much.
This is absolutely the right place for that kind of conversation that we're having. So we fight against world imperialism, UK imperialism, European imperialism, the labor, what's it called? The intellectual labor aristocracy and the labor aristocracy. It ain't easy, mate. It is not, it's definitely not. But I want to very briefly say the following. You don't need to know Marxism to fight against injustice. But if you know Marxism, it will make you a cadre, conscious cadre, that will make you better at it. And if you read Losurdo and you are immunized against Western Marxism, which is the purpose of all of this conversation, then you will be really a good one. So come to meetings in the Marx Memorial Library and read the book. Thank you very much, Alex. That was fantastic. Carlos Martinez is our last speaker, not necessarily the least.
Probably.
Carlos Martinez is an author and political activist from London. His first book, The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse, published in 2019. that book, he discusses that as with the Soviet Union, future socialist states will face many of the same external pressures from the imperialist world. In other words, how to survive in a context of unavoidable imperialist aggression. He is co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, co-founder of No Cold War, and a coordinating committee member of the International Manifesto Group. He writes regularly in the Morning Star, Global Times, China Daily, and CGTN, China Global Television Network. He has penned articles such as How Western Media Manufactures Consent for New Cold War on China in 2022, runs the anti-imperialist website Invent the Future, and has given remarkable interviews such as Lessons from China's Ascent on the CTGN radio podcast, The Bridge in 2025. Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francisco. I mean, literally everything that needs to be said about Western Marxism has already been said by the other panelists, but I've prepared a speech, so you're just going to have to bear with me. So yeah, I'm not that well qualified to speak on this topic really, in the sense that, you know, I've been involved in the Marxist movement in the West in one form or another since I was a teenager, but thankfully I've never got particularly close to Western Marxism as such. You know, the political tradition that I grew up in always emphasized the importance of supporting the socialist states, and it always emphasized the importance of struggle against imperialism, against colonialism, against racism. So to support China, to support the DPRK, to support Cuba, to support the national liberation movements of the Irish, Palestinians, Zimbabwean, Vietnamese, and other peoples was very much part of that tradition. So, you know, despite being a Marxist in the West, I haven't had all that much exposure to the Western Marxist academics that are described by Losurdo, and haven't had to go through that, you know, very difficult and protracted unlearning process that these guys perhaps have. You know, I've read lots of Lenin, I've read very little Adorno, I've read very little Zizek, I've read very little Perry Anderson, I've read very little Alan Baidu, and I've got no idea why the Chinese named a search engine after him. Nevertheless, you know, the Losurdo's book was very clarifying for me, and it helped me to understand the ideological roots of some of the political positions, reactionary political positions that you come across in the real world, you know, all the time in the movement. You know, although Western Marxism exists basically in an academic ivory tower, it does seep into the wider movement for revolutionary change, where it appears to find pretty fertile soil. Now, Marxism is obviously Western by birth, right? The first line of the Communist Manifesto is, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism." And the nascent communist movement was limited basically geographically to Western Europe and to North America. And it had as its target, as its subject, the industrial working class, the industrial proletariat. But I would say from the very beginning, and you know, we've heard a little bit about that, it's been on a journey to the east and to the south, including in Marx's own lifetime. You know, first, the phenomenon of imperialism, which was later studied more systematically by Lenin, but which Marx and Engels started to take note of in the 1860s and 1870s, expanded geographical sphere of operation, the creation of a proletariat, a class of propertyless workers from Mexico City through to St. Petersburg, through to Shanghai. Secondly, you know, Marx and Engels, their own thinking developed. They came to understand this unbreakable, inextricable link between the struggle of the working class in the capitalist countries and that of the oppressed nations against their colonial oppressors. And for Marx and Engels, this intellectual journey really begins with the Irish question. Of course, Ireland is not actually to the south or to the east, but it was England's first colony and had suffered for hundreds of years under a system of brutal colonial oppression. And Marx had originally considered that the socialist revolution in Britain would bring about national liberation in Ireland. In 1869, however, 21 years after the publication of the Communist Manifesto, he wrote that deeper study has now convinced me of the opposite. The English working class will never accomplish anything before it has got rid of Ireland. And he went on, a nation that oppresses another forges its own chains. And he called on his followers to put the conflict between England and Ireland in the foreground and everywhere to side openly with the Irish. He pointed out that the national emancipation of Ireland is no question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but is the first condition of the English working class's own social emancipation. So already over 150 years ago, the founders of scientific socialism, Marx and Engels, were already pointing sensibility of the struggle. That understanding also extended to the struggle against national oppression within the capitalist heartlands, what we today consider to be racism. Hence that very memorable sentence in Volume 1 of Capital, where Marx says that labor in the white skin can never be free as long as labor in the black skin is branded. So the development of imperialism gained pace, obviously, towards the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century. And Lenin noted that the concentration of capital had reached a point where monopolies were increasingly driven abroad in search of profit. As a result, more and more of the world was brought into the capitalist system, but not on equal terms. Rather, this was, in Lenin's words, a world system of colonial oppression under the financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the people of the world by a handful of so-called advanced countries. And he further notes, imperialism is leading to annexation, to increased national oppression, and consequently also to increasing resistance. And the strategic implication of all of this is that the working class in the advanced capitalist countries must unite with the broad masses of the oppressed peoples around the world against their common enemy, against the imperialist ruling classes. So, and hence, famously, at the Second Congress of the Communist International in 1920, the working class movement updated its kind of overarching slogan, which changed from workers of the world unite to workers and oppressed peoples of all countries unite. And again, just to go back to Marx's point that this is no question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, that means that while imperialism is strong, the ruling class is strong. The ruling class is powerful. It's power relative to the position of the working limited. National independence and sovereignty for the oppressed nations mean that the ruling class becomes weaker and the relative position of the working class becomes stronger. And that's why Lenin said in 1921 that the outcome of the struggle will be determined by the fact that Russia, India, China, etc., account for the overwhelming majority of the population of the globe. It is this majority that's been drawn into the struggle for emancipation with extraordinary rapidity. So there cannot be the slightest doubt that whatever the final outcome of there cannot be the slightest doubt what the final outcome of the world struggle will be. In this sense, the complete victory of socialism is fully and absolutely assured. So, we can see that already by 100 years ago, Marxism had developed a clear global applicability. It had gone from being the liberatory framework for the industrial proletariat in Western Europe and North America to being the liberatory framework of oppressed peoples and working peoples all around the world. And with Marxism's global applicability came Marxism's global application, the success of socialist and national liberation revolutions in Russia, in Korea, in China, in Vietnam, in Cuba, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and elsewhere. And all of these practical experiences of revolution have obviously contributed to the broadening and the deepening of Marxism. So, to me, the Western Marxism that we're talking about, that's described by Losurdo, the essence of it is it rejects this whole trajectory, this whole journey of Marxism to the south, to the east, around the world. Firstly, it more or less comprehensively rejects the experiences of actually existing socialism. The Western Marxist trend has consistently distanced itself from the process of building socialism in reality, be it in the Soviet Union, in China, in Korea, and elsewhere. And where these academics and these groups do support a socialist process, that's generally speaking highly conditional. Like there was some support from these sorts of circles for the first pink tide in Latin America, in Venezuela, in Brazil, and Ecuador, and Bolivia, and so on, at the beginning of the century. In large part, I would say, because it was a form of socialism that was being built within the respectable limits of bourgeois democracy. However, once the US stepped up its campaign of destabilization, its campaign of demonization, its propaganda campaign, and once countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua were forced to leverage, the repressive machinery of the state to protect their revolutionary processes and to protect the gains that had been made by the working class, by the peasants, Western Marxism became disillusioned and it increasingly withdrew support. Some Western Marxist thinkers were very much inspired by the Cultural Revolution, as I think Jennifer mentioned, in China, with its sort of pretty extreme emphasis on class struggle. But when, from the late 1970s, the Communist Party started to de-emphasize that domestic class struggle and found a place for capital within its development process, then Western Marxism just wrote China off as having restored capitalism. So, with Western Marxism, we always find what Losurdo called the dogmatic rejection of actually existing socialism. If a socialist project doesn't look like what we think socialist projects look like, then we don't like it and we reject it. And that's combined with, and obviously closely related to, a downplaying of the role of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles, a rejection of the notion that the primary contradiction in today's world is that between imperialism and the oppressed peoples, a rejection of the ideas of national liberation Marxism in a historical context where the vast majority of social experiments thus far have had a major national liberation component, be it in China, Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, Vietnam, Mozambique. The struggle for socialism has, in the history of the last century, been very closely bound up with the struggle against imperialism and the struggle for sovereignty and independence. Why is Western Marxism like this? And the other panelists have kind of have covered this to a significant degree, so I'm not going to talk very much about it. But Western Marxism's got lots of different trends and it's got lots of different contradictions. But I think its essence is these two rejections. A rejection of actually existing socialism and a rejection of national liberation. And both of these things are, ideologically speaking, a function of eurocentrism and a function of dogmatism. But it is also important to bear in mind that there's a clear material basis for a Western left that minimizes the national question. And in their introduction to the book, Gabriel and Jennifer mention how, the academic mainstream encourages a dogmatic, Eurocentric, and essentially inert Marxism that, and they create a situation whereby success in academia more or less relies on taking positions that don't fundamentally threaten the interests of imperialism. And I'd add, and we've talked about this, that this is really a microcosm of a trend that Lenin recognized over a century ago, whereby, quote, high monopoly profits for a handful of very rich countries opens up the economic possibility of corrupting the upper strata of the proletariat, creating a privileged layer of the working class that benefits from imperialism and therefore has a material interest in its success. And, I think the distortions of Western Marxism really represent the extension of this opportunist trend and this social chauvinist trend into the realms of academia. Where do we go from here? I do think it's important to recognize that the Western Marxist trend has produced some very valuable insights, in many cases has expanded Marxism into a range of academic fields, from gender studies to cultural studies and a good deal more. And since it's based in the it tends to address itself to problems faced by people in those countries. And on that basis, I think it has played some valuable role in moving human understanding forward. But there are a few things that we absolutely have to insist on if our movement's going to make any real progress. First is the primacy of anti-imperialist struggle, of solidarity with peoples fighting our ruling classes, of playing our part in a global united front against imperialism. And I think since it's the 50th anniversary today of the independence of Cabo Verde, it's appropriate to cite Cabo Verde's greatest son, Amilcar Cabral, who said, if imperialism exists, and is trying simultaneously to dominate the working class in the advanced countries and smother the national liberation movements in the underdeveloped countries, then there is only one enemy against whom we are all fighting. The second thing we have to insist on is the leadership of the socialist countries. It kind of should be obvious that it's the socialist world that's in the vanguard of the project of developing Marxism. That it's the states, the movements, the parties engaged in the process of building socialism that are doing the most to to build humanity's collective understanding of that project, of how to carry out that task that history has placed before us, completing the transition to global socialism. As Mao Zedong famously put it in his essay on practice, if you want knowledge, you must take part in the practice of changing reality. If you want to know the taste of a pear, you must change the pear by eating it yourself. And, obviously, I'm co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, and I've written a book called The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. So I kind of would say this, but I also think it's pretty crucial to understand, support, and learn from China, the largest and the most advanced socialist country that's at the core of an emerging multipolarity. And indeed, as China develops, China as an example of what can be achieved with socialism. And China simply cannot be understood within, through a lens of Western Marxism, through a lens of purism, through a lens of dogmatism. In the course of over a century of fierce and constant struggle, the Chinese leadership, the CPC, has developed a socialist path that's suited to the traditions of the Chinese people and adapts to the ever-changing material reality that they face. Outside an academic ivory tower, the questions of whether people have food on the table, whether they have health care, whether they have roofs over their heads, whether their children, have access to education and are literate, these are actually more important issues than whether there are billionaires in China or whether there are branches of KFC and Starbucks in Shanghai. Deng Xiaoping's insistence that development is the only hard truth and that poverty is not socialism might be dismissed as revisionist or capitulationist by well-fed intellectuals, but they reflected and they reflect the actual needs of the Chinese people. And Domenico Losurdo understood all this. On the question of inequality in China, Losurdo pointed out that China's rise constitutes the most extraordinary contribution to the fight against global scale inequality, the inequality between the developed and the developing countries. And he also pointed to the existence of what he called an absolute inequality that exists between life and death, which Chinese socialism has addressed with extraordinary success. Quote, eliminating once and for all the absolute qualitative inequality inherent in starvation and the risk of starvation. That's what a Marxist dialectical analysis of inequality in China looks like. On the question in the world, China's support for sovereignty and development in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, and helping countries around the world, especially in the global south, to break out of underdevelopment is far more important than whether people think that China should do more aid and less trade, or whether China should pursue, a more militant foreign policy. Suffice to say that the slogan, neither Washington nor Beijing, is not often heard in Palestine, in Iran, in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Eritrea, or in Zimbabwe. And again, Losurdo understood this very well, describing China as the country that more than any other is challenging the international division of labor imposed by colonialism and imperialism and furthering the end of the Columbian epoch, a fact of enormous progressive historical significance. And I put it to you that any Marxist who fails to understand this enormous progressive historical significance is, frankly, not actually a Marxist. So we've got a plan of action. Reject dogmatism, reject purism, reject eurocentrism, reject chauvinism, and get back to playing our part in a global united front composed of the socialist countries, the oppressed nations, and the working classes and progressive forces in the imperialist countries. That's going to be what gets us back on a path of a socialist future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. That was extremely, the phrase I like the most, dogmatic rejection of actually existing socialism. I'm not going to say more because of time. We have half an hour to have the deepest imaginable discussion about this after all these 4 presentations. So what I suggest we do is we take a couple of questions from the floor. If there is any in the chat, any question in the chat? I don't want to say, but that's good news. Any question from the floor? I will take 2, and please confine your contribution or question to 2 minutes. Ali, speak up.
It'd be good if people come to the front and then we use the microphone.
That's right.
I think the speakers referred to it, and you, Carlos, you ended with it. They shouldn't be called Marxists. Oh, I could just stand up. Yeah. So I think, as you said yourself in here, is call them Western Marxists is a contradiction in terms, really. Is Marxism is a scientific tool. So when China built their socialism, they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics. They didn't call it Marxism with Chinese characteristics. Marxism is a scientific tool for class struggle and progress. So really, they might call themselves Western Marxists, but we shouldn't be dragged into it ourselves into calling them Western Marxists. And it is not only a Western phenomenon. I mean, in Iraq and in the Middle East and so on, there are many similar, Marxists who are actually, we call them left imperialists, because they use the tool. They say we are Marx and everything, but they say we are communists, but actually they support imperialism and imperialist policy in the Middle East. So I think we should change the term. Probably we should call them left imperialists rather than Western Marxists, because really it's not only a Western phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon of intellectual bourgeoisie who have no faith in the working people, who have no faith in the working class. They were dragged for historical reason into the communist movement, into the Marxist movement, and then they dragged it to the right. They supported, first of all, the revision of the Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, they switched immediately into supporting American imperialism. And really the core of their ideology is an intellectual bourgeois ideology, went to the working class movement and used Marxism to justify their betrayal of the case. So really, I think we have to, but not to be dragged into this term of Western Marxism. Thank you very much. That wasn't a question. Any other questions? You might have it. You have that they know. One thing I wanted to point out is that also somebody it happens. Yeah, that's standard.
Ciao. We've talked a lot about the failings of Western Marxist stuff, and obviously we are not Western Marxists. We are, well, I don't want to say what we all are, but anyway, we're anti-imperialist. Is there any hope of engaging these so-called Marxists in our work at home, or do we just let them do their thing and carry on with our anti-imperialist and socialist campaigns in this country?
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Can I make a brief comment to Ron? I think Western Marxists suffered. I think here, Western Marxists suffered from a liberal engagement. Which is this? They tend to focus on the political form of governments and not on the class nature of the state. And that's for commentary at the end. Anybody else? I'll ask the panel to then come back.
I'll let you know. During the Soviet Union's era,
Yep.
and in the 60s, I think one of the theoreticians of the Soviet Union came up with the peaceful coexistence. And then they had slogans of the road to socialism with a non-revolutionary way through capitalism. It means the way of non-capitalist.
Non-capitalist road.
Yeah, it means when a coup d'etat military junta comes in and have a slogans of revolutionaries and so on, and yet they don't understand socialism. They don't understand to educate their populations, except maybe in few countries, which is we knew about, and we mentioned Venezuela and Iraq as well during Qasim, and Egyptians and so on. But there are a lot of reactionary juntas comes in the name of revolutionary, and they really deform any movement for socialism in their country.
Okay, thank you very much.
So what I'm saying is the center,
Yeah.
sometimes the center of so-called socialist countries,
Yeah.
if you follow it, they do the harm more than, you know, the imperialists themselves.
So can I recognize the panel starting from Carlos the other way around? Is that okay?
Yeah, just there's two questions that have come in
Yeah.
from the Zoom.
Okay, please
So
read
just
them out.
read those out, okay?
Yeah.
Beyond the political, military, and economic is an ordinary person in whose material world is exploitation by power. How does non-Western Marxism filter down to solve material problems faced by the ordinary majority? Another question, recognizing the importance of the anti-imperialist struggle, how do you see the struggle of the working class in the imperial core?
Last one.
And then, how can communists distinguish themselves clearly from non-communists despite all the misguiding self-labelings? Oh, is there one more? Yeah. Around 10,000 years ago, did the founders of civilization have in mind anything related to socialism in order to organize their society? Right.
Okay, since you were reading them, I'll start. Is that okay? Start from you, Alex. So what we're going to do is to get the panel to talk to, comment on these questions, contributions, and then we'll see another round.
Yeah, well, I'll try and say something to the first of the questions that you read out, Carlos. I can't repeat it because my short-term memory is not good enough. But it was asking about. Just read it back to me again, will you? Quickly, just.
So, how does non-Western Marxism filter down to solve material problems like that?
So I'm interested in that, and I'm also interested in the third question about the struggle of the working class and in the imperialist core. So, I think we need to recognise firstly that we're living in a new period, and the reason this is a new period is that we're currently in the West experiencing the third Great Depression of capitalism, which has been in existence since 2008, 2009, triggered by the US housing market collapse, and which has led to prolonged stagnation within capitalism, a failure of the capitalist developed nations to grow, and an inability to restore growth despite all of the solutions which they thought would work after 35, 40 years of neoliberalism. And we've now got a crisis of capitalism, not just a crisis within capitalism, but actually a crisis of a capitalist system, which is what is driving the increase in imperialist tensions around the world. The complete rupture of the globalized trading network, which was established under the GATS procedure and under 25, 30 years of neoliberal ideology, Trump's tariffs, and the enormous arms race that's taking place, particularly in Europe, with this demand for NATO member states to spend 5% of GDP on military. Now, the observation I want to make is that this is the first time in world history that there's been a crisis of capitalism when the leading economic power in the world is not a capitalist power, it's a socialist state. It's never happened before. In all of the previous crises, there was never a socialist state. Even when the Soviet Union was in existence in the 1930s, after the Wall Street crash, it was not the leading economic power in the world. China is the leading economic power in the world. And this means that we're living in a qualitatively different situation. And so at a very sort of simple level, I want to say that the choice for humanity now is literally a choice between socialism or barbarism. I mean, this is not just a rhetorical phrase anymore. Not that it ever was a rhetorical phrase for Rosa, but this is literally what we're faced with: the choice between Chinese socialism or US imperialism swallowing us and leading us into a nuclear holocaust. So my answer to the first question is we need to understand that this is a new and unique period in human history, and that we've got to show people who want to struggle against the ugly face of imperialism, which is extremely ugly today, that the real alternative is real existing socialism, not some academic form of Marxism, but real existing socialism. And it works. So, go to China, use Chinese technology, learn about China. That's really important, I think, in our work. The second question I just wanted to touch on very briefly is about the struggle of the working class in the imperialist core. And I think this is a very, very big problem because what we're seeing in the imperialist core, of course, is this long-term economic decline. I mean, if you look at Germany, it's deindustrializing. We deindustrialized in the 1980s under Thatcher. There were big struggles, but we've never reindustrialized. And we're still in this position of declining societies dependent on essentially serving banks in the city of London, acting as conduits for international. And it's all going to come crashing down. So what's the answer then, and what should be the demands of the working class in these countries such as Britain and Germany? Well, I think the key one has got to be around anti-militarism. This current demand that's being made, mind-boggling amounts of money being spent on gold-plating cruise missiles or whatever they want to do. I don't understand how you can spend that much amount of money, 1.5 billion pounds on 6 factories to build weapons. I mean, it's quite extraordinary the amount of capital that they want to soak up on it. So I think anti-militarism becomes then the key focus for the left in the working class movement, and particularly demands like welfare, not warfare, become central to what we do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the questions and comments. Regarding the first, I would say that one of the reasons that the term Western Marxism has stuck is because the imperial ruling class has invested very directly and very explicitly in Western Marxism. And so the term, I think, is somewhat inappropriate. I'd prefer imperial pseudo-Marxist because that gets to the core of what they do. But ultimately, there's a project, for instance, the Rockefeller Foundation ran the Marxism-Leninism project, and they funded to the tune of millions of dollars a global institutional network, leading scholars, including some of the most well-known scholars in the West. Herbert Marcuse, Isaiah Berlin was involved, Tom Bottomore in the UK was involved, Lucien Goldman in France, gave them research assistance, did editorial projects, funded doctoral grants, funded international exchanges. They explicitly wanted to, and did, develop Western Marxism as a theoretical weapon of war against the most threatening form of theory faced by the imperial ruling class. And that form of theory is Marxism, or more explicitly, anti-imperialist Marxism, Marxism-Leninism, call it what you will, but the Marxism of struggle, not the Marxism of imperial complicity. And so for that reason, I think that the term is legitimate in identifying what our enemies have constructed as a propaganda weapon of war against us. Concerning the second question of whether or not we engage with the Western Marxists, I do think that there are hegemonic, dominant forms of ideology that saturate the thoughtscape of so many people, and that if we just allow it to go on its own, then that means that new people coming into the struggle are going to be infected by, I liked your disease metaphors, right? They're going to catch the virus in various ways. And for them not to catch the virus, we either have to inoculate them against it, or we have to find ways of treating them if they've already been subjected to the red cover actually pro-imperialist. Western Marxism as a propaganda tool is ultimately the fight against imperial propaganda. And one big part of our struggle is to recognize that we are dealing with the most indoctrinated populations, arguably in the history of humanity. I say that coming from the United States, which has the most developed propaganda apparatus in the history of the world and has much more direct access to the mindscape of the masses. And what they've attempted to do is take the socialist alternative off the table in order to shore up imperial complicity. We have to be able to go after not just the imperial kind of propaganda apparatus in a way that we remain defensive, but we need to go on the offensive. We have to demonstrate that they lie to us systematically, they have a system of indoctrination, and they are doing it in order to be able to successfully industrialize social murder at a scale never before seen, and engage in ecocide and eliminate the conditions of possibility of at least human, if not all life on planet Earth. The last thing that I'd say is, and this resonates very strongly with Alex's extremely poignant points, is if I can collapse question 4 and 5, what is to be done? I'm glad this question is constantly raised. Being anti-imperialist in the imperial core is absolutely essential. Critical support for actually existing socialism, resonating with Carlos's statements, is absolutely essential. I'd just like to add one other which overlaps with the issue of militarism, and that is, due to the points that Alex just made, what we see across the capitalist world is rising fascism. The capitalist ruling class recognizes exactly what's going on with the global order, and what's their response to it? Their response is, let's try to engage in a strategy of chaos to destroy by any means necessary the development of a multipolar world in a socialist alternative. And let's also bring the war to the home front and make a war on immigrants and the racialized groups and the most oppressed and exploited members of the working class. And so just as we saw 100 years ago, but in different context, because the play of forces is rather different, the capitalist ruling class is having recourse to fascism, and so the fight against fascism is absolutely central, I think, to what needs to be done in the imperial core. And that means, and Losurdo is very good, I think, on this point, we need to defend democratic rights. We need to defend some very basic elements that aren't simply be thrown out in a kind of anarchist or ultra-leftist manner and say, well, who cares about these things like a state protecting rights, etc. Well, I care about them, and I think a lot of people should care about them, and we shouldn't engage in the kind of ultra-leftist dismissal of democratic rights. Let's just burn it all down, abolish the state, abolish law, abolish prisons, etc. Let's actually think clearly about the rights that we need to preserve in order to have space to develop the movements, the parties, the unions, the organizations that we need to push things in the right direction. I'll leave it at that, although there's obviously more that can be said, but we have 2 more great speakers, so I will shift the microphone to them.
Just before you want to warn the speakers, I'm going to ask some final comments. So people can, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you. Just briefly to the question of how does non-Western Marxism affect the life of everyday people, I think that is where its effects are, of course, most profound, with providing education, healthcare, huge, enormous growth in life expectancy, incredible improvement in the condition of women, struggles against racism. I mean, it is in the life of everyday people that the effects of actual Marxism are most profoundly felt. To the question of the role of what should be done within the imperialist core, as Gabriel noted, and also as Alex noted, with the crisis of capitalism, we see, the falling wages and falling life expectancy of the working class in the imperial core, with the right seeking to organize this discontent in the direction of fascism, in the direction of chauvinism and racism. And I think, it's absolutely imperative in this context to insist on the unity of the working class. And also in this context of capitalism's crisis and, the continued rise of China, we're also seeing some of the most violent and exploitative practices that imperialism has, historically used in the periphery being increasingly brought back to the home front and used, of course, on the most vulnerable sectors of the working class. And so, as Gabriel noted, I think in this moment, it's absolutely imperative to be defending the most vulnerable sectors of the working class, particularly, of course, immigrant workers, racialized workers. And this is absolutely tied to the struggle against militarism, also that Alex noted. We know, of course, that the forms of oppression that immigrant workers often experience within the imperialist core are, historically continuous with the forms of imperial oppression exercised in their home countries. And we also know, that the enormous and growing apparatus of repression being used against immigrant workers is also, an extension of the military-industrial complex, and it's, the huge transfers of wealth that it enables from the working class to the ruling class in its militarized industries, which itself is, an important, basis of this growing fascism that Gabriel is mentioning. I'll go ahead and end there and pass it on to you.
Thank you. Only pretty scattered thoughts for me. Thankfully, everyone else has responded very coherently. On Ali's question of what we should call Western Marxists if we're not going to call them Western Marxists, well, Lenin had a few choice terms that you can choose from. Social chauvinists, social imperialists, opportunists, sniveling bootlickers of the imperialist ruling classes, take your pick. So Lotte in the chat, who's a wonderful Danish comrade, very, very glad that she's on the call, asked about what all of this means for the struggle of the working class in the imperial core. And in a sense, it's a difficult question because we're putting forward a program of this global united front, which is internationalist, but which is very much oriented towards a long-term revolutionary strategy, and which doesn't, really address itself to the immediate short-term needs of the privileged layers of the working class. Like, to take an example which might have some current resonance in relation to an arms company like Elbit Systems, which has factories in this country and which produces arms that are being used in the genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza as we speak. What position do we take? Do we take the position of supporting people's jobs in those factories, or do we support the position of closing those factories down? And, that's obviously, it's a kind of slightly exaggerated and maybe like even cliched example, but I think it brings out this idea of firstly needing to orientate ourselves towards the long-term interests of the working class and the global working class, and to align ourselves with a global movement against imperialism and a global struggle for socialism. And it also strategically implies something that Lenin talked about a lot, and it's a very important concept that we need to think more about and engage more with, that we have to, as communists, as Marxists, we have to go lower and deeper. We have to not satisfy ourselves with addressing the privileged layers of the working class. And if you think about it, what layers of the working class are really at the cutting edge of radical and anti-imperialist struggle at the moment? What layers of the working class are rising up on the most cutting edge issue of our time, which is opposition to genocide and support for the national rights of the people of Palestine? It's not the privileged layers. It's not the people who work at Elbit System, et cetera, et cetera. It is those lower and deeper layers. And I think ultimately, if we're talking about a strategy for engaging with the working class and the imperial core, we really need to bear that in mind. And just quickly on this question of whether there's any hope of engaging with Western Marxists, I don't know if there is really. I don't think that engaging with those individuals is particularly, it might be interesting at an intellectual level, but I don't think it's a particularly good use of time, which is sadly a limited resource, as we all know and deal with every day. But, we do need to see the way that their ideas manifest themselves in the movement, as we experienced it all the time, and combat those ideas. And understanding the origins of those ideas and those incorrect positions is very important for countering them. If people that we're working with in trade union struggle, or any community struggle, any form of struggle, have got a line of, essentially de facto supporting NATO's position on Ukraine. It's helpful to us if we understand the theoretical framework that comes from, a theoretical framework that doesn't recognize the primacy of anti-imperialist struggle, that doesn't recognize the importance and the nature of multipolarity, that doesn't understand the importance of sovereignty, that doesn't, understand and uphold that famous sentence of Ho Chi Minh that nothing is more nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. Similarly, in relation to Palestine, if you say, well, there's people who have sympathy with Palestinians suffering under this awful Israeli onslaught, but they say, well, you can't support the Palestinian armed struggle because it's led by people who are not Marxists, who are subscribed to Islamic ideology, and who mustn't be mentioned because they're a prescribed organization. But we can understand that comes from a theoretical perspective, which again doesn't understand the need for a global united front, that doesn't understand the need to reject this dogmatism and purism. So, as in terms of engaging with Western Marxists as individuals, I wouldn't particularly bother. But in terms of understanding how their ideas seep into the movement, then I think it's very important to understand it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carlo. So very finally, Western Marxism has set a very high bar for what we do in the Global South. When in the Global South, we do the heavy lifting. Alex.
Well, my sort of parting.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm going to. I was just going to say in my final remark that, of course, the antidote, I can't remember who it was who used the word antidote, it might have been Gabriel. The antidote to nonsense is knowledge. And we need to guard, sustain, support institutions, platforms that allow Marxism, real Marxism, Marxism-Leninism, Marxism of class struggle to be taught, to be shared, to be discussed and debated. Never take those platforms for granted. And I know that there are people in this room who are not members yet of the Marx Memorial Library. So I'm going to make a plug and say, please join. Please become a member. It's not expensive. It's 25 quid a year if you're waged, all right, in London. And you can afford it, probably. So become a member. You can apply online or pick up a leaflet. This place puts on meetings. It provides a platform, a space for great discussions, great erudition, frankly, such as we've heard tonight from Jennifer and Carlos and Gabriel. And I think we've got to not take these places for granted. We've got to sustain them and support them. This place was founded in 1933 by a committee of trade unionists, socialists and communists who wanted to find a way to commemorate Karl Marx's life in this city 50 years after his death in 1883. And in 1933, the Nazis were burning his books in Berlin. So somebody from my union said, what we should do is set up a library to make sure we guard his books and let people learn from them in London. So they understood at a time when fascism was rampant in 1933 in Europe, that it was necessary to build institutions to teach Marxism, to teach Leninism, to teach real socialism. So I think that's the key lesson for me about the situation we find ourselves in. Don't take anything for granted and make sure that we teach the real science of Marxism to another generation that's coming through now and will be experiencing the hunger and the difficulties that the collapse of capitalism around us is going to lead our society into now.
Thank you very much, Alex.
just to conclude, I would say that we, objectively speaking, live in extremely exciting, albeit terrifying times. In the last 50 years, we have moved from a world of the end of history and the annihilation of communism to a world in which the capitalist world system is in deep, deep crisis and has to have recourse to rising fascism, with China the world and it's developing an exceptional architecture for what might exit humanity from the Columbian era, as Losurdo calls it, meaning the 5 centuries during which subhumans worked for the true humans, who ultimately all fed into the ruling class. And so this is an unbelievably, objectively interesting and exciting time to live in, while at the same time, it's subjectively terrifying. Because individuals are subjected to the worst forms of violence, repression, racism, misogyny, etc. And so one of the tasks I think that we have before us is, as much as possible, coming together subjectively so that we can build the power theoretically and practically to bring into harmony the objective potentials of the world that we're currently living in with our subjective lives, with our individual lives. And that requires working together, getting rid of chauvinism, shelving opportunism, recognizing that each of us has a contribution to make, and that we all have to work together to be able to do that. And we also have to show sectarianism, campism. So if the camps are imperialism and anti-imperialism, be campist. But if the camps are about sectarian divisions, then we should shelve them. And I think that's one of the most important things that we can do, is harmonize ourselves subjectively so that we can move the objective potential of the world that we're living in the right direction. And that will also ultimately help us all subjectively, because we'll live in a world with less imperialism, less genocide, less militarism, and much greater equality and ideally ecological sustainability.
Thank you.
There have been so many brilliant comments here. I was particularly struck by Alex's comment where he said pessimism is an alibi for willful retreat by intellectuals from the class struggle. And I think this is such an important point, and it reminded me of Lenin in on left-wing communism and infantile disorder talks about how this kind of pessimism can be another side of a sort of petty bourgeois predilection that is particularly found within imperialist countries, where a kind of frenzied rebellionism can just as easily succumb to defeatism and pessimism. And, you know, for precisely those reasons, one should not seek any kind of political or intellectual leadership among that particular strata. Losurdo is putting forth. And, you know, at this, also this comment about this sort of pessimism, I very much agree with Gabriel that this is also a moment for incredible optimism. And that was something that my own experience going to China and seeing socialism with Chinese characteristics, but also seeing communists from around the world speaking about the importance of China's leadership in the struggle for building socialism and combating imperialism on a global scale gave me enormous optimism. And I think that's another, thing for us to take away from all of this.
Right, thank you. Well, I'll just completely abuse my position to thank everyone for coming and to thank all the organizations that have put work into to organizing this event. I'll name them. That's Friends of Socialist China, the International Manifesto Group, the Morning Star, the Marx Memorial Library, Critical Theory Workshop, Iskra Books, and Praxis Press and Manifesto Press. And also represented here in the audience is the Black Liberation Alliance, the Communist Party, and different sections of the Palestine Solidarity Movement. And I think it's a great collection of people and a great collection of groups that we've got in this meeting that are all working towards the kind of strategy that we've been talking about for the last 2 hours of developing a global united front of the socialist countries, of the national liberation movements, of the countries of the global south, and of the working class and progressive forces in the West, in the advanced capitalist countries. We're all attempting to find ways to go, as Lenin said, lower and deeper, and to push things forward. So I would just encourage people to get involved with these organizations, engage with these organizations, engage with the work, contribute to the work, and let's move forward in a spirit of unity. Thank you.
Can I just finally say it's been extremely enriching. There's no question about it. So can we give the panel a very, very strong round of applause?
People need to start to do towards the top of the run.
And given that life is difficult and we are facing a very massive crisis, we're asking you to give generously a donation towards the cost of the room, please.
Go to David to do that.
And
also
then David's
buy
at the
copies of the book.
And also, can you show please join the Marx Memorial Library. You have at the end, when you're leaving out, take a copy of the leaflet and join in. Thank you very much. That was wonderful.
Yeah.